America's Journey from Isolation to Global Power. In the years leading up to the Second World War, American public opinion was fiercely divided. The Axis powers, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan, were widely viewed as a threat. But how far the United States should go in aiding the Allies was a subject of intense debate. After the devastating First World War, the U.S. had retreated into its familiar shell of isolationism, a policy reinforced by President Woodrow Wilson's failure to secure ratification of the Treaty of Versailles. The scars of war were still fresh, and the nation wanted no part in the growing conflict overseas. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, however, had other ideas. Although personally inclined toward a more assertive foreign policy, Roosevelt had his hands tied. The economic devastation of the Great Depression meant that his primary focus remained on the New Deal, and congressional support for any military action seemed out of reach. Isolationism dominated the political landscape of the 1930s, and Roosevelt allowed Congress to pass a series of neutrality acts that effectively handcuffed American involvement in global affairs. As a result, the U.S. stood on the sidelines during major conflicts, such as the Second Italo-Ethiopian War and the Spanish Civil War, maintaining a veneer of neutrality while fascism spread unchecked across Europe and Africa. That all began to change in September 1939, when Germany's invasion of Poland triggered the beginning of World War II. The Blitzkrieg, a lightning-fast assault that left Europe reeling, was a wake-up call to the world. Congress, still wary of direct involvement, allowed foreign nations to purchase American war materials on a cash-and-carry basis, but there were limitations. The United Kingdom, facing severe financial constraints due to British hard currency shortages and the Johnson Act, struggled to meet even the most basic demands for equipment. Meanwhile, Roosevelt's top military advisors remained cautiously optimistic that the Axis powers would be defeated by the European allies, convinced that America's military strength was best reserved for defending the Western Hemisphere. But the world was changing fast, and so was America's role in it. By 1940, the United States, while still technically neutral, was beginning to position itself as the arsenal of democracy. The once hesitant nation was now supplying war materials and financial aid to the Allies. President Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill struck a deal: 50 aging U.S. destroyers in exchange for 99-year leases on British military bases in Newfoundland and the Caribbean. It was a quiet but significant shift in American foreign policy, a move that signaled the U.S. was ready to tiptoe out of its isolationist cocoon. Then came the sudden and brutal defeat of France in the spring of 1940. With France under Nazi occupation, the gravity of the situation became impossible to ignore. The United States began rapidly expanding its armed forces, even instituting its first-ever peacetime draft. The specter of German aggression loomed large, and as Hitler's gaze turned eastward, the U.S. initiated backdoor negotiations with the Soviet Union, anticipating a showdown on the Eastern Front. Under-Secretary of State Sumner Welles began a delicate diplomatic dance with Soviet Ambassador Konstantin Umansky, sensing that the fragile balance of power in Europe was about to tip once again. By June 1941, Hitler had launched his invasion of the Soviet Union, and the U.S. was left with little choice but to ramp up its efforts. The Lend-Lease program, initially aimed at supporting Britain and China, now extended to the Soviets, a bitter irony given America's long-standing mistrust of communism. Roosevelt's advisors warned that the Soviet Union would crumble within weeks under the Nazi onslaught, but the president remained resolute. On the advice of his close confidant Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt blocked Congress from interfering with aid to the Soviets. It was a gamble, one that would cost countless lives, but ultimately pay off in the grand chess game of geopolitics. In August 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill met in secret aboard the USS Augusta, anchored off the coast of Newfoundland. There, in the quiet waters of Placentia Bay, the two leaders drafted the Atlantic Charter, a visionary document that outlined their shared aspirations for a post-war world. It was a bold statement, envisioning a future where nations would embrace democracy, free trade, and collective security. Yet, even as they set their sights on shaping the future, both men knew that the immediate battle for survival had only just begun. The United States was no longer a passive observer in a distant conflict. It was becoming a central player in the greatest war the world had ever known. The nation that had once vowed to stay out of Europe's affairs was now building the foundations for a global order, a journey from isolationism to intervention that would leave a permanent mark on the 20th century. America's transformation into the arsenal of democracy was not just a shift in military strategy. It was the beginning of a new world order, born in the fires of a war that had tested the limits of human endurance and resilience. If you like this content, don't forget to hit like, leave a comment, and subscribe for more.